of the Boundary Waters. Kris has a PhD in economics. She worked for the World Bank for 20 years in Washington, D.C. She's worked in most regions of the world on strategies, policies, and projects to promote economic development. I think rural America should hire her and do some economic development in a New Deal program for rural America, not just on the Iron Range. Since moving to Ely, Dr. Hallberg has continued her work as a consultant. Kris also volunteers with a local nonprofit to assist small businesses in the region. Let's welcome Dr. Hallberg.
Okay, if I can just figure out how this thing works. There we go. How's that? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk on economic inequality, that is inequality of incomes and wealth in the United States. And I'm going to argue that this has become one of the fundamental issues of our time, and certainly for the 2020 elections. And even a background issue for some of the issues that we think are the most important issues going on right now, like international trade or industrial structure or healthcare. What's really in the background is economic inequality. So it's important to pay attention to. And the key questions that I want to look at are looking historically how income and wealth have become more unequally distributed in the United States. What are the reasons for that happening, and what are the results, what are the consequences of that happening? And can we do something about it? Can those trends be slowed or reversed? And what does that mean for the policies being proposed by the political candidates? Okay, so let's get started. I'm taking a lot of this material from a book. Let me even show you the book. Written in 2014 by a French economist named Thomas Piketty, and it's called Capital in the 21st Century. This 400-page economics book was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a bit of a tough read, but it's really interesting. So, and the author actually put all of his charts on his website, so you can just download them. And so a lot of my charts came from his work. You need a very careful comparison over time and across countries of what's going on with income and wealth concentration in the world. So this is one of his most important graphs. If this doesn't make sense to you, raise your hand and say, I'm confused. This shows over the last century, from 1910 down here to 2010 here, the share of US income going to the top 10% of people. Okay, so it's a top 10% share. And he's got it going from 25% down here to 50% up here. And what you can see is that income inequality was really high up till about 1940. That is, the share going to the top 10% was somewhere between 40% and 50% up until about 1940. And then it went way down, and then kind of stayed down until 1970, 1980, when it started to go back up. So, what was going on here? I mean, back here, that was kind of the Gilded Age that it's referred to, concentrated wealth, ownership, and income shares going to the wealthy. And then you had the Great Depression and 2 world wars, and in particular World War II, where during the Great Depression, people lost assets. During world wars, especially World War II, we had an increase in tax rates to finance the war. And then we had the New Deal, with the New Deal, we had the creation of Social Security, minimum wages, and then at the same time, the rise of the labor movement, something we've been talking about a lot today, made a big difference. And inequality, that is the share of national income received by the top 10%, went from 45% down to like 32% in the mid-40s. And then, we kind of enjoyed this post-war period where incomes were fairly well distributed. And during a time when the economy was growing, and those benefits of the growth were more widely shared in the population. And you can also kind of remember, that was kind of a stable period in terms of how people got along with each other and how they felt common goals and worked toward them. Well, maybe that was kind of a reason. And then starting around in 1980, we started going back up to Gilded Age levels of concentration. And so now, well, actually, this is in 2010, this is before the latest tax reform, we're back up to kind of Gilded Age levels of inequality. So, when I first looked at this graph, I thought, oh my God, it really is shocking. We had really changed from a time period when most of us remember, 1950s, 1960s, when things were much more equally distributed. And in fact, this graph just shows the top 10%. If you looked at the top 1% of the population, or even the top 1/10 of 1%, you'd see even a more dramatic increase. So there have been huge increases at the top level, not just the top 10%. At the same time, as we referred to also in previous presentations, there's been a stagnation of wages in the low and middle income ranges. Okay, so people are noticing this. It really is going on. If you look at wealth inequality, now wealth is the stock of assets owned by the population. So that would include financial assets, real estate, personal assets, and actually business assets as well. The top line here gives the share of wealth of the top 10% of the population, and this is the top 1% of the population. This actually covers 2 centuries, 1810 to 2010, and the vertical scale is different from the last slide. It goes from 0% to 100%, so the 50% mark is about here, right? And in fact, wealth is more concentrated in the US than income is. And you can see that, again, around 1910, we had very high wealth concentration that went down to around the 50s, 60s, 70s. And since then, it's started to increase. And when you look at some of the specific numbers on this, it's really shocking. Like the top 400 wealth owners in the US, so the top 400 people in the US in terms of wealth ownership, have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. That means 400 people have more wealth than 150 million people. So it's really concentrated at the top. Looking at other countries, just for a bit of a comparison, this shows, again, the scale is 25% to 50%. This is income inequality, so the share of the top 10%. And the US is here, and Europe is here. So, way back in 1910, or before, let's say before 1915, the US was more equal than Europe. But since then, the US has become more unequal and has increased faster. The inequality has increased faster in the US than it has in Europe. And the US is diverging from the rest of the world, become becoming more concentrated in its income and wealth than the rest of the world, even compared to Europe. Of course, compared to the Scandinavian countries, but even if you include the rest of the European countries. But, you know, this phenomenon of increasing inequality is a global phenomenon, not just a US phenomenon. We'll look at a little bit more of the reasons behind the recent increase in inequality in a minute, but just looking at whether that increase in inequality is coming from labor income versus non-labor income. Labor income is, you know, wages and salaries, compensation to workers, versus returns to capital. So interest on your savings account, investments, things like that. Most of the increase in inequality has been due to an increase in labor income inequality. And what you really notice is at the really high levels, that 1% and 1/10%, those are the sometimes called super managers, referred to in the health presentation, of CEOs who get enormous compensation, often not linked to their productivity. I mean, studies have been done to see if those salaries actually reflect the fact that these managers generate more profits for their corporations, and you can't find much of a link there. But they're able to negotiate somehow with their shareholders and boards of directors high salaries. So that's driving a lot of this increase in inequality. The other thing that's interesting is that there's an increasing wage gap between the more highly educated and the less highly educated. And that's not just liberal arts colleges. Technical skills are getting a higher premium now as well. And there was one statistic I saw that said that cardiologists used to earn 4 times as much as nurses, and now they earn 7 times as much as nurses. So you see this kind of increasing wage gap going on also. So there's greater inequality in returns to capital as well, but not quite as much as on the labor side. So why is this all happening? Why is inequality increased? Since about 1980, there have been political shifts, as you all know, and starting with the Reagan years, where the wealthier have been able to argue for tax decreases on their income. And, well, I'll show another slide on taxation. But income taxes have become less progressive. In fact, let me show that slide now. This was in an article in the New York Times, just I think day before yesterday. Valerie, correct me if I'm wrong. Yesterday, New York Times. Really interesting research that looked at total tax rates paid by different income groups in the United States. And this means combining federal, state, and local taxes. So this includes your federal income tax, your state income tax, property taxes, excise taxes, payroll taxes, like everything you need to pay to a governmental authority. And we have down here the lower income groups and higher income groups. And so this shows, you know, the different average tax rates paid by different income groups in 1950 and 2018. And this also really shocked me when I looked at it, because in 1950, tax rates actually were quite progressive, right? The tax rates paid by the higher income people were on average about 70%. And now they're down to, it's like 23%, I think, in 2018. Whereas the tax rates on the middle and lower income people haven't changed all that much. So you really see an abandonment of the progressive tax system. And it's partly because excise taxes, sales taxes, property taxes tend to be regressive. Because if you're a poor family, you're spending a lot of your income on groceries and rent, so that those property taxes and sales taxes and things if you pay them on food. I guess not always on food, but the kinds of things that you have to buy and you save less than a rich family, you end up paying more of those taxes. So when you add up all of the types of taxes, we've really moved from a progressive system to a more regressive system. And that's a lot of what's driving increases in inequality. But there are other things going on too. We were talking about the decline of labor unions. Back in the 1950s, about a third of workers were covered by a labor union. Now it's about 11%. It's, more public sector workers are covered. They're are included in labor unions. I think it's about 40% in the public sector, but it's only about 5% in the private sector. So loss of bargaining power vis-a-vis corporations has driven some of this wage stagnation. Financial sector deregulation that's happened more recently tends to favor high earners. And then technology and globalization. It turns out most studies argue that technological change has caused more inequality than globalization has. So why does globalization get more of the blame? I think it's because it's easier to attack globalization. You should say, let's put tariffs on, let's be more protectionist, rather than saying, let's prohibit robots in the workplace. Right? That's a little bit of a harder political sell. So I think globalization is a factor, but it hasn't been one of the main factors behind increased inequality. The other thing that Piketty argues is that in periods when the return to capital, that is, the income you get from your assets, financial assets, real assets, when that return to capital exceeds the growth rate of the overall economy, you get increasing inequality of wealth. And the growth rate of the economy, you can kind of think of that as being correlated with the growth of labor income. So when you get an increase in returns to capital greater than the increase in returns to labor, you get increasing wealth inequality. And they argue that what that's doing is kind of pushing the US into a rentier economy. That is, more incomes are derived from returns on assets held than on labor. And so it's, it's better to be a holder of assets these days. And a graph that shows this, now, I don't know where he got this data, because this data goes from year 0, I guess. How did he figure out the return to capital back then? I don't know. But you have to keep that in mind when you look at the graph. It goes up to the future, 2100. So really, the time that we're looking at is more, okay, around here would be like 1980, okay? And this is the return to capital, and this is the growth rate of world output. So this is global, growth rate of world output, and kind of interpret that as the return to labor. And what you see is that since 1980, we've kind of reversed, and the return to capital has gone higher than the return to labor. And what he's arguing is this is going to keep happening. That's why he goes all the way out to 2100 here. He thinks that the growth rate of the global economy is going to continue to go down at the same time as the return to assets will go up, so we'll get increasing wealth inequality. So it's kind of a depressing picture. So, a lot of people, and maybe this is more on the conservative Republican side, argue that you need some inequality to spur economic growth. And you need incentives for people to save, to invest, to innovate, to be entrepreneurs. Because, if you got nothing financially from doing that, why bother, right? And that's sometimes the argument in the Scandinavian countries. People say, well, look at Scandinavia, they have no incentives to invest or to better themselves. I think that's true, but only to a point. I mean, especially if you consider that the US is becoming more of a rentier economy, you're really not talking about the same incentives. The incentives are to kind of protect your assets rather than to invest in a small business or to get more education so you get a higher wage, things like that. If you're just enjoying the return on your assets, you don't have the same incentives as you would if you were relying on your labor income. So, I'd say that there's something to be said for that argument, but at some point, in fact, there have been studies on this also, at what point does inequality hinder economic growth? And one study really shows that an increase in the income share of the top 20% is associated with lower economic growth, gross domestic product growth. And what that says is that the benefits of that growth at the high end don't really trickle down. Okay, and that's, I think, another misleading idea we've been told. And on the other side, an increase in the income share of the bottom 20% is associated with higher economic growth. In other words, the poor and middle class matter for growth. And if you remove some of the constraints on opportunity felt by the lower and middle income classes, that spurs economic growth. So improvements in health outcomes, improvements in education, benefiting the lower and middle classes really do spur economic growth. So I think it's not too hard to come up with arguments against that simplistic trickle-down idea that, frankly, since the Reagan years has been disproved. So we come to kind of the biggest impact, I think, of inequality is, yeah, there's an impact on economic growth, but I think that the bigger impact is on the social and political side. And in fact, as I was saying before, I think some of the other policy positions taken by different sides reflect this, that there's this lack of social cohesion going on, that and a kind of frustration with the political process and increased polarization in politics. I think a lot of that is derived from this feeling like, the game isn't working anymore. These few people at the top are getting all of the benefits of our economic growth. We're stagnating back here, and that's driving a lot of the conversations we're having now, where there's this background resentment, which is understandable. I mean, I don't think we can just say that's not a legitimate way to feel. I think it's a very legitimate way to feel. The question is, what do you do about it? And as you know, the concentration of income and wealth way at the top also grants political power to those people. And we have also a system where those people can contribute to political campaigns. So, the whole political system is being warped by the concentration of income and wealth at the top. Similarly, I think there's a feeling on both the left and the right that the system is rigged. There's no longer this trust that the system is fair. And that goes into their opinions of government institutions. Are they working for us still or not? Into the implementation of policies. I mean, if people think the system is unfair, they're going to rebel against it. Just a little bit of my own history with this. In the World Bank, for years and years, our mission statement said, reduce global poverty, right? And even the ambitious objective of eliminate global poverty. And that was great. But about 10 years ago, it was changed to reduce global poverty and achieve shared prosperity. And what that meant was, it was recognized at the global level that inequality was a really important issue now. And that, separate from helping the poorest of the poor, we had to do something about sharing prosperity more widely. So, probably led to an even greater emphasis on policies and projects that benefited the middle class, not just social safety nets for the lower class. And so, you know, a key question for us and for the next election is, how much inequality are we willing to tolerate as a country, and what are we going to do about it if we think inequality is too high? And I think that's a lens through which we should be looking at the political platforms of the different candidates. One other little kind of interesting thing here is to look at, there was another article, I think this is also in the New York Times, came out of a Brookings Institution study on the diverging economies spatially, rural versus urban, and how that related to the political parties. And as you know, increasingly higher income workers in the tech sector, private sector, high-paying firms are migrating more toward urban areas, and in particular coastal areas, whereas the people who work in traditional industries, who often are less educated, white, and male, are more heavily represented in rural areas. And if you look at just the last 10 years, so this goes from 2008 to 2018, these elections, this shows you median, that's sort of a measure of average household income per district. So the blue line is Democratic-leaning districts, and the red line is Republican-leaning districts. Democratic districts have actually increased in income quite a bit, and they tend to be the urban, more educated, high-tech, high-wage workers, whereas in Republican districts, more rural, older, their median household income has fallen. So there's this divide going on too, you know, and sometimes, actually it was interesting, the map that Trump showed on his Twitter page about a week ago, that actually I think his daughter or daughter-in-law produced, where it showed all the red counties in the last election, and then there was this little blue fringe on the coast. Actually, we were a little bit blue up here in northeastern Minnesota too. And he was saying, look how many people voted for me. And, you know, of course, the counter argument is that land doesn't vote, people vote, right? And the people are concentrated in the urban areas. But still, it reminds you that there's this big divide going on between rural, less educated, less diverse areas and the more urban, more diversified, higher income areas. That's really a serious issue for the Democratic Party to take on. And maybe one point of entry is labor unions, but there should be other points of entry too, I think. So that's all I have. You've probably had enough graphs. Oh, wait a second. I'm sorry, I have one more. I forgot. The policies to reduce inequality. Yeah. What Piketty suggests in his book, which again is about global inequality, is a global annual wealth tax. That is, all countries agree with each other on a certain tax, progressive tax on wealth that's assessed every year. And that would include, you know, financial assets, real estate assets, personal assets. He himself recognizes that this is unrealistic to expect. I mean, if we can't cooperate on climate change, it's kind of unrealistic to expect that we'll all agree on tax rates on the wealthy. So he backs off that and says, well, maybe we could have agree on regional wealth taxes, like maybe Europe could agree on a wealth tax. Maybe they don't seem to be moving in that direction of more agreement rather than less agreement. But a couple of our candidates have suggested a US wealth tax. In particular, Sanders and Warren have suggested wealth taxes increasing on higher and higher wealth rates. You know, I think that is a good idea in the sense that it addresses this fundamental problem that the return to capital is exceeding the return to labor. And in order to capture that kind of explosive increase in concentration of wealth, we have to tax wealth. The problem is that a wealth tax has been tried in a lot of different countries. In fact, it was actually tried in the state of Massachusetts in the 1970s. But it was tried in a lot of Scandinavian countries, and all but one abandoned the idea. Norway still has a wealth tax, but other European countries have eliminated them. And why? Because they're costly to administer. It's difficult to value wealth. I mean, every year you're going to go in and value artwork or jewelry or things like that held by individuals. And it's also easier to evade than income taxes are. You just move your assets abroad, right? Which is why Piketty suggested a global wealth tax. But if we're going to try it in the US, we have to worry about those things. Now, Piketty and a couple of his colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, have been advising the Warren campaign. So I'm hoping that those lessons of international experience are entering into the policy proposals. But I'm a little bit, skeptical because it's been tried before. But I think there's a lot of room to move back toward a progressive income tax system. In fact, there have been studies that show that you can go pretty much all the way up to a marginal rate of 70% on the highest incomes without reducing total tax revenue. I mean, for those economists in the room, we're talking about the elasticity of tax revenue with respect to tax rates. At some point, tax revenue starts to increase until you get to a certain high level of taxes, and then people stop working as hard and tax revenues start to fall. Well, you could go up to about 70% without creating that disincentive effect. And now we're only at, 35%, something like that. So there's a lot of room for a more progressive income tax system. And then coming back to the health presentation, I think there's also a lot of room for policies that address the issues of opportunity of the low and middle income classes. Healthcare is one, education is another. I saw a quote the other day that said, we're moving from an economy that used to be learn, work, retire. Go to school, have your career, and then retire. Now we're in an economy that requires us to learn, work, learn, work, learn, work, right? So we're in an economy that requires continual education, and education policies ought to reflect that, not just go back to a system of 50 years ago. And then capital ownership stake for labor. Again, maybe this is something ideal, but maybe it's something that could be adopted by individual corporations of profit sharing, of sharing the returns to capital with labor that might go some way toward